We're being sold as a set, me and my son." The words tore out of the man's throat like they were being ripped from his ribs, raw and broken, and loud enough to hush the crowd for a heartbeat. Then the August sun pressed down again on the town square of Redemption Falls, Colorado territory, baking dust and cruelty together into something that smelled like heat and desperation. Men tugged at their collars, women fanned themselves, and the auctioneer's voice cracked through the air like a whip. "Lot number 7, he bellowed. "Indenture contract, 5 years labor. 1 adult male, 1 male child. Sold together as a set unless bid otherwise." Clara Brennan stood at the very back edge of the crowd, already taller and wider than most of the men around her. 35 years old, 320 pounds, dressed in a dark blue dress that made no attempt to hide her bulk. She was used to people shifting away from her, cutting glances at her body, pretending not to stare, and failing. Today, for once, no one was looking at her. They were looking at the platform. The man up there was enormous, even beneath his bruises. Broad-shouldered, 6'4" at least, sunburned and half-starved. One eye was swollen shut, his jaw was cut, and he held himself stiffly as though every breath hurt. His big, battered hands rested on the shoulders of a boy who could not have been more than 7, thin as a rail and clinging to his father's leg like if he let go, he'd fall clean off the earth. "This here is Nathaniel Kane," the auctioneer called. "Trap man, mountain man, good with an axe and a rifle. Owes First Bank of Redemption Falls $800 in unpaid medical and legal debts. The property's already seized, so we're selling his contract. 5 years labor. The boys included." Nate's uninjured eye burned. "He's my son," he said hoarsely. "We stay together. You swore it." The auctioneer waved him off. "Now, who'll start me at $50 for the pair?" Silence. A hard, embarrassed silence. Clara felt bile rise in her throat. She'd come to town to buy fence wire and seed, not watch human beings sold off like spare mules. Her late father's ranch, 15 miles north, sat secure on land and gold money. She had more cash in the bank than she knew what to do with. Land, cattle, a big, solid house. Everything, people said, except a husband and children. $30, a man near the front finally called. "For the boy alone. I don't want the man, he looks half useless. I'll take the little one. Cheap hands are still hands." The child flinched. Nate made a sound, half growl, half sob. "You can't," he choked. "You can't take him from me. You can beat me, starve me, work me to death, but you don't take my boy. Please." The auctioneer smirked. "Contract says they're a set unless separated by necessity. 30 for the boy. Do I hear 35? 40? Clara's hands were shaking. She thought of her big, empty house, her silent suppers, the way men in town eyed her purse and her land, but never her face. She thought of that little boy's fingers digging into his father's torn coat. If you're listening to this story right now, tell me, where in the world are you? A crowded city? A small town? Somewhere you've seen people look away from suffering because it wasn't theirs? Clara took one step forward, then another. $200, she said, her voice ringing clear across the square. For both, together, as a set. The crowd turned as one to stare at the fat woman at the back, the one no one had bothered to notice until she spoke. On the platform, the mountain man's knees buckled. He caught himself on the boy's shoulders, eyes flooding. You bought us?" he whispered, disbelieving. Both of us? Clara met his gaze and felt her life tilt. Yes, she said. Both of you. Clara saw a moment of cruelty and chose to change 2 lives forever. As you listen to this, where in the world are you? A bustling city, a quiet room, or somewhere in between? Let me know in the comments. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and follow for the next chapter of Nate and Clara's journey. The square emptied quickly once the papers were signed. People always dispersed fast after a debt auction, as if lingering might stain them with the shame they'd just witnessed or participated in. Clara counted out the cash in crisp bills, signed the purchase ledger, and received the stamped indenture contract. Legally, Nathaniel Kane and his son Daniel now belonged to her labor for 5 full years. Except the way Nate looked at her. Raw, bewildered gratitude mixed with disbelief made the word belonged feel obscene. You kept us together, he said again, as if repeating it would help it sink in. Miss Brennan. Why? Because no one else would, Clara answered simply. And because I couldn't stand there and watch your boy torn away from you. Nate swallowed hard. His breath hitched. He blinked rapidly, fighting emotion with the stubborn pride of a man who'd learned tears brought no mercy. Daniel slipped a small hand into Clara's and whispered, "Thank you, ma'am." Her heart clenched. You're welcome, sweetheart. Let's get you both someplace safe. She led them to her wagon, loaded earlier with fencing wire and flour sacks. Nate limped heavily, each step jolting his ribs. He hid it poorly. His shirt was torn, stiff with dried blood, and the bruises blooming under his jaw were angry and deep. Were you beaten today? Clara asked quietly. Nate hesitated. Yesterday, and the day before. For resisting separation, she murmured. For defending my son, he corrected with quiet fury. They wanted to take him first. Said a small boy fetched higher demand than a grown trapper. I told them over my dead body. That nearly became literal, Clara said. Nate looked away. It would have been worth it. They climbed into the wagon. Clara took the reins, giving Daniel the front seat beside her while Nate settled in the back. The child pressed close to her hip, warming instantly to the comfort of proximity. Nate watched from behind, astonished at how easily his boy trusted this stranger. They left Redemption Falls behind, its wooden storefronts, its dust, its cruelty masquerading as law. The trail north wound through pine-shadowed hills, golden grasslands, and quiet creeks. Daniel nodded off before they'd gone a mile, his head bumping gently against Clara's shoulder. You can lay him in the back, Nate said softly. He hasn't slept more than an hour at a time in weeks. Clara shook her head. He's fine right here. He knows warmth when he finds it. Nate's breath caught. He looked away quickly, hiding his expression behind the wagon tarp. 2 hours later, they reached the Brennan Ranch, a sprawling, thriving property Clara had inherited 6 months earlier. Fenced pastures stretched across the valley. Barns and sheds stood sturdy and freshly painted. A white house with green shutters sat at the center, solid and welcoming. Nate stared. This is yours? My father's first, Clara said. Mine now. He blinked as if the idea itself was foreign. You run this whole operation alone? I hire hands seasonally, Clara said. But yes, my father taught me everything. He just never believed I could manage it without a husband. A bitter laugh escaped her. Probably because I didn't fit the idea of a frontier bride. Too large, too quiet, well, too much. Nate frowned, confused. Too much of what? Clara paused. She hadn't meant to say that out loud. Of me. Nate shook his head slowly, studying her as though trying to solve a puzzle. But before he could speak, his ribs buckled. He huffed sharply, gripping the wagon's edge. "You're hurt worse than you admitted," Clara said. "I'll manage." "You won't have to," she replied. "Come inside." He opened his mouth to protest, then Daniel stirred awake and reached for him with a frightened whimper. Nate swallowed whatever prideful refusal he'd been about to make. Inside, Clara boiled water, fetched her father's medical kit, and lit lamps around the kitchen. Nate sat stiffly on a chair, one hand on the table to keep himself steady. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to his torn shirt. Nate hesitated only long enough to remember he had no right to modesty in this house. Then he nodded. Clara unbuttoned the shirt carefully. Her breath caught at what she revealed. His chest and ribs were a map of torment. Deep purple bruises, long whiplashes, raw scrapes, half-healed gashes. His left rib cage was swollen, likely cracked. Daniel, sitting nearby with a tin cup of milk, whispered, "They hurt Papa." Clara's throat tightened. "I see that, darling." Nate tried to shrug as she cleaned a blood-crusted cut near his ribs. "They said I was resisting arrest. And were you?" "Damn right I was," he said. "They tried to put Daniel on a separate wagon. I fought until they knocked me unconscious." Clara met his eyes and said, not gently, "Then you did the only correct thing." Nate froze. Most people called him reckless, stupid, violent. No one had ever called him correct. Clara finished binding his ribs, smoothing the cloth with hands gentler than anything he'd felt in months. When she rose, he found himself staring at her, her strong arms, her full chest, her soft face lit by lamplight, her steadiness. "You don't know what you've bought," he murmured. Clara held his gaze. "A father, a son, and a chance for them to stay together. That's worth more than $200. Emotion slammed into him so hard he had to grip the table. "Miss Brennan," his voice cracked, "I don't know how to repay you." "You'll work," she said simply. "You'll heal. You'll raise your boy. That's all I ask." She turned to check on Daniel at the stove, giving Nate space he suddenly needed. Because for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt the fragile, terrifying stir of hope. The first night should have been awkward. 3 strangers under one roof, one of them legally bound to the woman who now fed him, housed him, and tended wounds he hadn't let anyone touch in years. Instead, it was quiet, peaceful, strange. Daniel fell asleep curled against Clara on the settee, small fingers tangled in the fabric of her dress as though terrified she might disappear if he loosened his grip. Clara didn't move for nearly an hour, simply stroking his hair with a tenderness Nate had seen only once before, on Sarah's final days. When Clara finally lifted the boy, effortlessly, despite her size, and carried him to the spare bedroom, Nate stood in the kitchen doorway watching her, struck silent by the sight. She tucked Daniel into bed with a soft whisper and a warm quilt. Then she returned to Nate. "You can have my father's old room," she said. "It's clean. Sheets are fresh." Nate shook his head quickly. "I'll take the bunkhouse." "You can barely breathe without wincing," Clara said. "You're not sleeping in a cold shack tonight." "It doesn't feel right," he said quietly. "Me in the house while Daniel's sleeping alone in the other room." Clara blinked. "You think I'd separate you? The boy can sleep with you, Nate. Always." His breath shuddered. "Thank you." 2 hours later, with Daniel asleep beside him, Nate stared at the ceiling of a real bed for the first time in months and tried to understand why his chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with bruised ribs. In the next room, Clara lay awake too, listening to the wind, listening to the silence, listening to her own heartbeat pounding like she was the one who'd been rescued today. The next morning revealed just how much work the ranch needed. Clara had been holding everything together alone for months, managing cattle, patching fences, shoveling feed, hauling water, repairing gear. Her strength was real, but she was exhausted. Nate saw it within minutes. "Where are your ranch hands?" he asked. "I can't keep seasonals year-round," Clara said. "They drift from job to job. I do what I can between them. The ranch was built for a family, but there's only me." She'd said it calmly, but Nate heard the loneliness stitched through her words. Loneliness he understood too well. "I can handle the barn repairs," Nate said, "and the corral fence, and the trough lines." "You're still healing," Clara protested. "Then I'll heal while working," he replied, and gently, carefully took the heavy buckets she was lifting. It was the first time in years that someone had relieved Clara of a burden instead of watching her carry it because they assumed she could take anything. She stared at him, unsure what to say. So she simply said, "Thank you." The days that followed fell into a rhythm so natural it startled them both. Clara cooked, cleaned, tended the books, mended clothes, and managed the house. Nate repaired, hunted, mucked stalls, cleared brush, reinforced buildings, and trained Daniel in chores. Daniel followed both of them, shadow to his father, apprentice to Clara, slowly shedding his fear, learning to laugh again. And in the quiet moments between chores, something warm and dangerous began to take shape. A lingering glance while hanging laundry, a brush of hands passing tools, a shared smile over supper when Daniel babbled about feeding the chickens. A moment in the barn when Nate reached past Clara to grab a harness, and she felt the heat of him behind her, close, protective, respectful. He always stepped back quickly. She always felt the loss. One evening, a storm rolled over the valley. Slow thunder, sheets of rain drumming on the tin roof, flashes of lightning illuminating the mountains. Nate and Clara sat by the hearth while Daniel slept in the next room. Clara worked on her mending. Nate whittled a spoon from a piece of pine. For a long while neither spoke. The fire popped, the rain softened. Then Nate said softly, "I'm sorry you had to buy us." Clara looked up sharply. "I wasn't forced." "You shouldn't have had to," he insisted. "You shouldn't have spent that money to protect a man you didn't know." "I'd do it again," she said simply. Nate opened his mouth, then closed it. His expression tightened. Pain. Not from bruises, but something deeper. "Do you know what hurts most?" he asked quietly. "Not the beatings, not losing my cabin, not being marched onto that stage like an animal." Clara set her sewing aside. "What hurts most, Nate?" "How little people cared." His voice cracked. "They didn't see me." They didn't see Daniel. They saw debt, profit, worth. Like our lives only mattered if someone could use us. Clara leaned forward. "I saw you." "I know," he whispered. Then his voice softened even further. "Why? Why did you look at me and see a man worth saving?" Clara swallowed, unable to lie. "Because I know what it is to be looked through, looked past, ignored, judged without being known." Her voice broke. I know what it is to stand in a crowd and feel invisible." "And you're not invisible," Nate said fiercely. "Not to me. Not since the first moment I saw you." Clara blinked rapidly, stunned by his intensity. "Nate." He stood suddenly, wincing as his ribs protested, and walked to the window, putting distance between them. "I can't say more," he said, voice low. "Not yet. Not while I'm your contracted man. Not while you hold that paper. I won't put you in that position. And I won't risk you thinking any feeling I have is born of obligation." Clara's breath hitched. "What are you saying?" "That there are things I want to say," he murmured. "Things I feel. But they have to wait." He turned back toward her, rainlight flickering over his bruised face, his hazel eyes dark with something unspoken but powerful. "But I want you to know this," he said. "You didn't just buy us, Clara. You saved us." Her eyes filled. "And one day," he whispered, "I want to deserve you." The fire popped, the storm rumbled, and Clara Brennan, fat, overlooked, dismissed by an entire town, felt something bloom inside her that she had buried decades ago. Hope. By late October, the Brennan Ranch no longer felt like the cavernous, echoing place Clara had lived in alone for half a year. Laughter lingered in the hallways now, small, bright giggles from Daniel, and deeper, quieter chuckles from Nate that seemed to vibrate through the whole house whenever Clara accidentally said something funny. She hadn't meant to make him laugh so often, but Nate laughed easily around her, like the sound had been trapped in his chest for years and suddenly found a way out. And every time he laughed, Clara felt warmth bloom under her ribs. The morning frost glittered silver across the fields when Clara stepped outside carrying 2 steaming mugs. Nate was repairing the split-rail fence, his breath fogging with each exhale. Daniel knelt nearby with a tiny hammer, imitating his father's movements in miniature. Clara watched them for a moment, the contrast of their frames, one tall and powerful despite his weight loss, the other small and thin but determined. A father and son who'd nearly been torn apart, now working side by side, perfectly in sync. "Coffee," Clara called out. Nate straightened slowly, pressing a hand to his ribs. They were healing, but deep bruises clung stubbornly. "You're an angel," he said, taking the mug. His fingers brushed hers, warm, calloused, lingering half a second too long. Clara's pulse jumped. She stepped back before her reaction became too obvious. Daniel tugged her skirt. "Miss Clara, look! I fixed a nail." "You did wonderfully," Clara said, crouching down. "That fence is lucky to have you." Daniel glowed at the praise. Nate watched Clara with something soft in his eyes, something he always looked away from too quickly. "We'll need new lumber soon," he said. "I'll go into town next week." "No," Clara said immediately. "Your contract allows it, but I'd rather go with you. If the bank men recognize you, they'll remember the man who punched their agent," Nate admitted. "And they'll remember me," Clara replied. "The woman who publicly defied their auction. I'm not letting you walk into that alone." Nate held her gaze. Long, steady, fierce. "You shouldn't risk trouble on my account," he said. Clara answered quietly. "Then who should I risk it for?" Something shifted between them, something heavy and unspoken. Daniel looked between them, puzzled. Then he said brightly, "Can I ride into town too?" The spell broke, gentle as snow. That night, after putting Daniel to bed, Nate found Clara in the barn carrying bales of hay she had no business lifting alone. "You shouldn't be doing that," he said, taking the bale from her arms with effortless strength. You're still healing, she protested. You need to rest. Resting doesn't fix roofs or mend fences. Nate? Their hands touched on the same bale. He didn't withdraw. Clara, he said softly, you can lean on me. You don't have to do everything alone anymore. She swallowed. I've always done things alone. I know, he murmured. That's why you're so strong. But strength doesn't mean you don't deserve help. The words landed deep, too deep. Clara stepped back, overwhelmed by how much she wanted to lean into him, for real, not just metaphorically. That want scared her more than loneliness ever had. You should rest, she whispered, retreating before she said something foolish. Nate didn't follow, but his eyes followed her until she disappeared through the barn doors. Snow arrived early. One morning, Clara woke to silence, thick, muffled quiet that only came after heavy snowfall. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside to find the ranch blanketed in snow up to her knees. The barn roof bowed under the weight. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. Nate was already outside, clearing a path to the chicken coop with a shovel. You should have woken me, Clara said, trudging toward him. You deserve to sleep, he replied without pausing. So do you. He looked up, breathing hard, snow clinging to his hair. I can't sleep while there's work to be done, especially not if it means you'll try to do it. The irritation in Clara's chest dissolved into something warm. You're too stubborn, she said. So are you. Their eyes met, again too long. Nate looked away first, shoveling harder than necessary. Inside the house, with the storm trapping them, routine slipped into something more intimate. Clara cooked stew with rosemary and venison Nate had hunted days earlier. The scent filled the house with comfort and memory. Nate repaired a broken chair by the hearth, legs stretched long across the rug. Daniel sprawled on his stomach nearby, drawing pictures of the ranch with charcoal on scrap paper. Clara watched them as she stirred the pot, and something inside her whispered, "This is what a family looks like." Not the one she'd been denied all her life. The one she had found. Late afternoon faded into deep blue twilight. The blizzard howled against the shutters. And for the first time, Clara realized she wasn't afraid of storms anymore. Storms meant they were together. When night settled fully, Daniel fell asleep in Clara's lap again. She stroked his hair until his breathing deepened, then carried him to bed. When she came back, Nate was still by the fire, staring into the flames like they were speaking to him. "You should rest," Clara said gently. He didn't look up. "Can't." "Why?" He hesitated. Then he said it low, raw, unguarded. "Because being in this house terrifies me." Clara's heart lurched. "Why would this place frighten you?" Nate lifted his gaze, and the truth in it nearly sent her to her knees. "Because I like it too much." Her breath caught. "I like the warmth, the quiet, the way you hum when you cook, the sound of your footsteps, the feel of Daniel safe in a real bed." His voice cracked. "I like you too much, Clara." Her pulse thundered. He stood, slowly, walking toward her, not close enough to touch, but close enough that she felt the heat of him. "I'm a contracted man," he said. "I have no right to want anything here." "But I do. God help me, I do." Clara whispered. "Nate." "I told you before," he said hoarsely. "I can't say what I want to say. Not yet. Not until I'm free. Not until you know there's no obligation. A hot tear slid down Clara's cheek. But I need you to know something, he said, voice trembling for the first time. Every day I'm here, every time you look at me, every time you speak kindly to Daniel, I feel myself falling a little more, and I don't know how to stop. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, a different storm began to break open. Clara forced herself to speak past the ache swelling in her chest. You don't have to stop, Nate. His breath hitched. But you do have to wait, she whispered. Because I want to meet you at the end of that road, and not as your employer. Nate closed his eyes in visible pain and relief. When the contract ends, Clara said, if you still feel the same, then you can tell me everything. Nate opened his eyes. And if you still feel the same, he murmured, I will. Their breath mingled in the warm light of the fire, and without touching at all, they shared the closest thing to a kiss they had ever had. The first warning came on a quiet morning in late November. Clara was in the kitchen, kneading bread dough, when Daniel ran in from the yard, breathless and pale. Miss Clara, someone's coming up the road. 2 riders. Clara wiped her hands and stepped onto the porch. Nate was already there, axe in hand, eyes narrowed toward the distant specks moving steadily up the snow-dusted trail. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. The color drained from his bruised face. It's them, he said quietly. The bank men. Clara's stomach twisted. The ones who beat you? Nate nodded once. They weren't done. They want something. Daniel clung to Clara's skirt, trembling. Nate stepped between them without thinking. By the time the men rode into the yard, coats heavy with frost, horses snorting steam, Nate stood planted like a granite cliff, Clara and Daniel behind him. The taller of the two, a sharp-faced man with a thin mustache, pulled off his gloves with theatrical slowness. Well, well, he drawled. If it ain't Nathaniel Kane. Looking healthier than when we last saw you. I'm impressed. Nate didn't blink. State your business. We heard a rumor, the man said, that some foolish ranch woman bought your contract at the auction. Whole town's talking about it. Clara stiffened. Nate didn't look back, just stepped another half-inch closer to her. What does that matter to you? He said. Oh, it matters plenty, the thinner man replied. See, you still owe us money. You can't pay a debt when you're hiding away on some woman's land, getting fed, warmed, and coddled like a baby. Nate's jaw clenched. My contract with Miss Brennan supersedes your claim. Only if she keeps you alive, the man sneered. If something happens, your debt reverts back to the bank, and then the boy can be resold, separately this time. Daniel whimpered and buried himself in Clara's skirts. Nate's voice turned to steel. Say another word about my son and I'll... Clara spoke before he could finish. This ranch is private property. I will ask you once to leave. Both men turned their gaze on her, and then the insult. Well now, the taller one smirked. I can see why Kane let himself be bought. That's a whole lot of woman to keep a man warm on winter nights. Nate moved so fast the snow beneath him sprayed outward. He didn't punch the man. He didn't grab him. He simply stepped so close the horses shifted anxiously, feeling the sudden threat radiating from him. You insult her again, Nate said, voice low, and I'll bury you so deep the snow won't find you. The air went silent, brittle as ice. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. No one, not her father, not any man she'd ever met, had ever spoken in her defense with such unhesitating fury. The bank men swallowed hard, reevaluating the situation. "We'll be back," the taller man said. "You owe us money, Kane."
"And a woman like her can't protect you forever." Nate took a step forward. The horses spun, panicked. The men rode off at speed, snow kicking up behind them. Clara and Nate stood frozen until the riders vanished from view. Then Daniel began to cry. Inside, Clara wrapped the boy in a blanket and held him in her lap while Nate paced the kitchen like a trapped wolf. "They won't stop," he muttered. "They'll keep pushing. They'll try to scare you, Clara, threaten you. They'll come again." "We'll handle it," she said softly. "You shouldn't have to handle anything because of us." Clara looked down at Daniel's small face pressed into her side. "This family is worth handling things for." Nate stopped pacing. Slowly, painfully, something in him crumpled. "Family," he echoed. You think of us as family?" "I do," Clara said simply. He looked like she'd struck him, hard. Not in pain, in shock. Warm, unbelievable shock. He turned away abruptly, leaning his hands on the counter, shoulders shaking. Clara crossed the room and stood behind him, not touching, simply offering presence. "Nate," she said gently. "What's frightening you more? Those men, or the idea that someone might actually care about you?" He let out a strangled breath. "The second one," he whispered. And that was when Clara finally understood. This wasn't a man afraid of violence. This was a man afraid of belonging, because belonging could be taken away. Rumors spread in town faster than winter wind. The fat Brennan woman bought a man at auction. "She's taken in that trapper and his boy. She's keeping them like her own. She's a fool for kindness. He's using her. He'll run off when the contract's done. He'll break her heart." Clara heard every word during her next supply run. Nate rode with her, tense as a bowstring, refusing to let her out of his sight. In every store, every boardwalk, every set of watching eyes, Clara felt judgment. But Nate felt something different. He felt rage. "You don't have to hear them," she murmured, as they loaded flour and sugar into the wagon. "They're insulting you," he said, voice taut. "They've always insulted me. They shouldn't. They don't matter." He turned sharply toward her. "You matter." Her breath hitched, but before anything more could be said, a hand slammed onto the back of the wagon. The bankmen, again. "Afternoon," the mustached one drawled. "Heard you brought your pet with you." Nate grabbed Clara's arm instinctively. The man smirked at the gesture. "Tell you what," he said, "we'll make you a deal. Sell us the boy, just the boy, and we'll forgive the rest of Kane's debt. Clean slate. You'll save yourself 5 years of feeding 2 mouths." Clara went white. Daniel wasn't even here, and the suggestion made her sick. Nate stepped between them so fast the wagon rocked. "You're not laying a finger on my son," he snarled. "Oh, we're not laying a hand," the man said. "We're offering a transaction. A smart businesswoman would consider it." Clara found her voice. "I am considering it," she said coldly. Nate whipped around, shocked. Clara stepped forward. "I'm considering how much rope I'll need to drag your bodies out of my barn if you ever suggest that again." The men froze. Nate froze. Then he looked at her like she'd just set fire to the entire town with one spark. "Let's go,"
Clara said, climbing into the wagon. Nate followed silently.
Only after they'd left town limits did he speak. "You'd really fight them," he whispered. "For you," she said. "For your son. For our home." Nate's hands tightened on the reins. A tremor ran through him, a mix of fear, gratitude, and something deeper, hotter, uncontainable. "Clara," he said, voice thick, "when this contract ends, if they come again, if any danger comes—" She turned toward him. "I want to stand beside you," he finished quietly. "Not as your laborer." The wagon wheels crunched over snow. Clara's breath trembled. "Then stand beside me now," she said softly. Nate's jaw tightened, emotion threatening to break him open. "I will," he whispered. And he did. From that day forward, anyone who came for Clara Brennan or her ranch saw something new. A mountain man standing in front of her with his whole body, and a fat woman standing beside him with her whole heart.
The attack didn't come in broad daylight. Cowards rarely strike when a man can see them coming. It came at dusk, when the valley dimmed into that blue-gray half-light, when the first stars blinked awake, when the ranch felt caught between day and night. Daniel was inside helping Clara prepare supper. He was humming, stirring a pot far too big for him, trying to copy the way Clara always did it. She pretended not to watch him from the corner of her eye, but every time he smiled, her heart did something soft and unfamiliar. Nate was outside splitting logs in the yard, breath steaming, shoulders moving with steady power. A perfect evening. Until the horses arrived. Hard, fast, too many. Clara heard them first. Nate sensed them before a single hoof hit the snow. He straightened slowly, eyes narrowing toward the tree line. His hand found the axe handle, his breath stilled. "Clara," he said, voice low. "Take Daniel inside. Bar the door." Clara froze. "Nate." "Now." It wasn't an order. It was fear. Real fear. Fear for her. Clara grabbed Daniel gently but firmly and pulled him behind her. She didn't go inside immediately. She stayed in the doorway, watching the riders break out of the trees, 6 of them, the bank men at the front. The mustached one raised a rifle. Nate stepped forward, not backward, placing himself directly between the riders and the house. "I told you," Nate growled, "if you came near my son again." "We're not here for the boy," the man called out. "We're here for the woman." Every vein in Nate's body went tight. Clara's breath stopped. "She interfered with a legal debt auction," the man continued. "Harbored a violent debtor, threatened bank officers. She's violated territorial law. We're taking her in." Nate barked a terrible, disbelieving laugh. "You're not laying a finger on her," he said. "This doesn't concern you," the man replied. "She is my employer," Nate said, voice rising like a storm. "My protector. My home. And if you think I'm handing her over to you, then you're more foolish than you look." The man lowered his rifle barrel toward Clara. Nate moved like something born of instinct, born of fear, born of love he had never been allowed to name. He stood between Clara and the gun before the man even finished lowering it. "Nate," Clara whispered, stepping forward despite his outstretched hand trying to keep her back. "Stay behind me," he said. "Please." Daniel whimpered behind Clara's skirt. The bank man smirked. "Look at that. The fat shepherd's gathered herself a guard dog." Nate's entire frame went rigid. He stepped closer to the mounted men, jaw tight, voice shaking. "Insult me all you want, but insult her again, just once more, and you won't leave this ranch." The man tilted his head.
You think you can take 6 guns? I don't need to take 6, Nate said. Just you. His hands were empty. No rifle, no pistol, just the axe at his feet.
The mustached rider flicked his hand. 2 men dismounted. Clara stepped forward instinctively, but Nate blocked her with a single, solid arm. "You stay inside," he told her. "I won't hide," Clara said, voice trembling but fierce. "Clara." He turned, and the look on his face nearly brought her to her knees. "I need you safe. I can't fight if I'm worried about you." Her breath broke, and in that single moment she understood something. He wasn't protecting her because she owned his contract. He was protecting her because he loved her, because he had loved her long before either of them dared name it. Snow crunched as the men approached. Nate bent, picked up the axe, and swung it once, clean and smooth, to test the weight. "Nate," Clara whispered, voice shaking with terror. "Don't die for me." He didn't look away from the approaching men. "I'm not dying," he said softly. "I'm choosing who I stand with." The first man lunged. Nate struck, not to kill, but to disable. The handle caught the man in the knee, dropping him screaming into the snow. The second man rushed in. Nate pivoted, drove the axe handle into the man's ribs with a crack that echoed across the valley. The mounted riders scrambled, suddenly realizing that a man fighting for what he loves is far more dangerous than a man fighting for survival. The mustached man drew his gun. He aimed at Clara. Nate roared. Not a human sound, an animal sound. He launched himself between the gun barrel and Clara just as the man pulled the trigger. The shot blasted through the cold air. Snow leapt from the ground. Daniel screamed. Clara gasped. Nate staggered. But he didn't fall. He turned. A tiny hole smoldered in the sleeve of his coat. A graze. A miracle. Nate reached down, grabbed a fistful of the mustached man's coat, yanked him off the horse, and slammed him into the snow with a fury born of months, years of humiliation and helplessness. The man looked up at Nate's face and understood instantly. He wasn't fighting a debtor. He was fighting a man who had chosen his family. "Listen carefully," Nate snarled. "If you ever come here again, for me, for my boy, for my wife..." Clara sucked in a breath. Nate didn't correct himself. He didn't step back. He didn't apologize. He simply finished, "You won't leave this valley." The man scrambled back, terror wiping the arrogance from his face. "Mount up!" he yelled. The riders fled in a panic, leaving 2 groaning men in the snow. Nate watched them go. Then he dropped the axe and turned toward Clara. She ran to him and collided with his chest, arms wrapping around him before she could stop herself. He held her, tight, desperate, alive. "You could have died," she choked. "So could you," he murmured. "I don't care about me," she said. "I care about you and Daniel." His arms tightened around her. "I know." She pulled back, tears streaking her face. "You called me your wife." Nate froze. His breath shook. Then, quietly, "I meant it." For a long moment after Nate's quiet confession, time didn't move. Snow drifted around them like falling ash. Daniel stood in the doorway holding the spoon he'd been stirring with, eyes wide, chest heaving with leftover fear. Nate didn't look away from Clara. He looked terrified. Not of gunshots, not of debt collectors, but of her answer. "Nate," Clara whispered, breath clouding the cold air between them. "Did you mean it? Truly?" He swallowed hard. "I did."
I shouldn't have said it like that, not in the middle of a fight. Not while I'm still bound to you on paper. Not when... Nate? He stopped. Clara stepped closer, her hands trembling as she reached up, cupping his bruised face with extraordinary gentleness, as though he were something precious, something hers. "You didn't say anything wrong," she whispered. "You spoke truth in the moment you thought you might lose everything." Nate's eyes closed, emotion rippling across his battered features.
"I'm not a free man yet," he murmured. "And I didn't want you to think that any feeling I have is just because you saved us. I've been fighting the timing, fighting the contract, fighting myself."
"So don't fight anymore," Clara said softly. Nate's eyes opened, hazel, bright, fearful, hopeful, desperate. "I love you," Clara whispered, voice breaking on the words she had never dared to say to anyone. "I love you, Nate Kane. Not because you're strong or brave or loyal. Not because you needed saving. I love you because you are good. Because you protect those who cannot protect themselves. Because you've brought life into this house and warmth into my days. Because you've shown me a kindness I've never known." Nate stared at her, breath shaking, shoulders collapsing like a man who'd carried too much weight for too many years. "Clara," he breathed. "I love you," she repeated, firmer this time. "The contract didn't make that happen. You did." Snow crunched behind them.
Daniel stepped closer, his small voice trembling.
"Papa," he whispered, "is Miss Clara gonna go away?"
Nate dropped to one knee and pulled his son into his arms. "No," Nate said, voice breaking. "No, son. She's not going anywhere. Not if she'll have us. Not if she'll have me." Daniel looked at Clara with wide, shimmering eyes. "Miss Clara, can you stay my family?" Clara felt her heart crack open in the most beautiful way. She knelt too, gathering them both into her arms, her voice thick with tears. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart. I promise." Nate pulled back slightly, searching Clara's face with raw vulnerability. "When my contract ends," he said hoarsely, "I want to ask you properly, on my knees, with no paper binding me but the one I choose. I want to give you a ring even if it's carved from pine. I want to be your husband because you say yes, not because you feel obligated. So I need to ask you this now." He took her hand, calloused fingers trembling. "When the time comes, Clara Brennan, if I ask you to marry me, will you answer with your whole heart?" Clara didn't hesitate.
"Yes," she whispered. "With everything I am. Yes."
Nate exhaled shakily and pressed his forehead to hers as Daniel hugged them both. Wind howled outside, but inside this small, snow-covered ranch, 3 people held one another in a warmth no blizzard could ever touch. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, curled between quilts Clara had sewn herself, Nate stepped out onto the porch. Snow glowed faintly beneath the moon, the ranch quiet except for distant horses shifting in their stalls. Clara joined him, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. Without speaking, Nate took her hand, the same hand that had lifted him from despair the day she bid $200 at an auction no one else cared about. "You're safe here," he murmured, "if you want to be, if you'll stay." Clara squeezed his fingers, tears warming her eyes. "I'm home, Nate, as long as you'll have me." And though no wedding band yet sat on her finger, and though the world beyond Redemption Falls still whispered, judged, doubted,
Inside this lantern-lit porch, hope burned brighter than any fear. A single question lingered softly in the cold night air. Could a love born from mercy and held together by courage survive everything still waiting beyond the valley?